English translation, 725th Contact, Part 1. Saturday, the 12th of October, 2019, 23:58 hours.
Welcome to Greetings, dear friend.
Thank you for your welcome and greetings, Edward, dear friend.
Then I would like to ask right after that, how about what you briefly hinted at the other day, but did not say anything clearly about Ireland, Yemen, and Albania?
Have I actually failed to speak clearly about this? We talked about upcoming events, and I said that towards the end of next month, November, there will be a strong earthquake in Albania with many deaths, while in Yemen there will be an outbreak of dengue fever which will also cause many deaths. As far as Ireland is concerned, I would like to say that the shameful practice of pedophilia has spread not only among the Catholic clergy there, but also among many, if I may say so, Catholic shepherds of souls in France, Germany, in all the states of the Brussels dictatorship, as well as all over the world. Pedophilia is also practiced all around in circles of other faiths, and not only by males, as is generally assumed among the population, because female pedophilia actually also exists, albeit to a lesser extent than among males. Pedophilia is widespread on earth to an alarming degree, especially among believers in the Christ religion who, under the cover of their faith, are able to deceive their family members, acquaintances, and fellow human beings in general. Through digitalization, the possibilities for like-minded people to come together have expanded just as badly with regard to disgraceful pedophilia as they have with regard to equally disgraceful fornication and other dehumanizing depravities.
Unfortunately, these degeneracies are getting worse and worse among many earthlings, because, as you say, digitalization offers the morally completely degenerate and depraved more and more opportunities to spread their primitive dirty activities further and possibly never be punished for them. In particular, Europe is a vicious Christian pedophilia hotbed, where children of both sexes and all ages, right down to infants, are sexually abused in a totally degenerate way, destroying their consciousness and the thought and feeling world as well as the psyche. And through these criminal, degenerate cruelties against the children, they are so harassed and suffer torments that they can never cope with the whole of the criminal, deviant, shameful, and contemptuous sexual degenerations committed against them, and will therefore suffer psychologically destruction and be imprinted for their whole lives. And that all the pedophiles, who are especially widespread in the entire Christian world, as you Playaran have clarified, as you explained the other day, that, in my opinion, casts a very special scummy light on this denomination and religion, as was also the case with the Christian religious wars, the witch hunts, the Crusaders, the Knights Templar, and with many other monstrous Christian murderous machinations, etc., as far as pedophilia, fornication, crime, and many other completely degenerate things are concerned. Everything is getting worse and worse in relation to the inexorably growing overpopulation. And in this relationship, that which is getting worse is also the case with the destruction of the climate, which, as a result of the growth of the Earth's population and its machinations, is bringing more and more disaster. And in the process, humankind is being lied to and deceived through its teeth by the climatologists and all the researchers and scientists, etc., connected with it. This is because the truth is that everything concerning the destruction of nature, the planet, and everything in general is much worse than is deceptively and publicly admitted. The real state of pollution of the atmosphere and the entire world by CO2, nitrous oxide, methane gas, and 1,000 different toxins, etc., is in reality much higher than the experts lie about. They also conceal from the Earth's population that they are absolutely incapable, because they have no devices and apparatus, etc. And these would first have to be invented, of measuring the true masses of the thousands of gas toxins in the atmosphere. These loud-mouthed scientists, researchers and climatologists, etc., are also obviously not yet aware that all these poisonous gases react with and among each other in the atmosphere. creating new and completely unknown poisonous gases which are extremely carcinogenic and cause more and more different types of cancer in human beings, mammals, animals, and many other living beings. But what is effective reality and truth? And this must also be said, with regard to climate destruction. This does not correspond to what the naive little Greta Thunberg has done, and has made the whole world crazy and hysterical, and has also spread and eaten into the unreasonable government circles. The nonsense and imbecility of Fridays for Future alone, whereby riot and terror-like demonstrations are held worldwide mainly by children, juveniles, and only half adults every Friday, corresponds to such stupidity that it is absolutely ridiculous. And this stupidity testifies to the fact that, starting with the naive little Greta Thunberg, who has since become megalomaniacal, the entire mass of demonstrators has no idea whatsoever what they are nonsensically demonstrating for. On the one hand, all the nonsense measures that have been fantasized about so far, and those that are still being fabricated, will no longer prevent climate change and all future natural disasters. On the other hand, the whole thing is being hyped up for hysterical, idiotic reasons and made much worse than it really is. And that's because this exaltation can stir up the stupid majority of the people, who cry out for crazy measures, which are then to be implemented by the responsible rulers and various corporations, whereby the ruble rolls into the coffers of governments and business enterprises in the billions. So the whole thing of the well-considered machinations of artificially forced excitement, hysteria, theatricality, and the entire exaggeration of the freaking out, shouting about and nonsensical demands for measures by the demonstrators and various organizations of the same ilk and other agitators, as well as the corresponding reactions of the rulers, ultimately only has the purpose of financial exploitation of the peoples. And the fact that the naive and ignorant little girl Greta Thunberg has been abused by the Fridays for Future organizations from the very beginning, and continues to be abused by the Fridays for Future organizations that emerged from the whole clambake, in order to make themselves important and to make profit, is not recognized by the majority of their supporters due to their stupidity. The fact that the girl is also delusional about her greatness and has also been deluded into thinking that she has done something particularly good and is now an icon, etc., is of no concern to anyone. None of all the Greta Thunberg supporters are, as a result of stupidity, in a position to consider what the consequences of the climate change demonstration nonsense will be, as even little ignorant Greta cannot. Her childlike and still weakly developed consciousness, the lack of life experience, and the necessary comprehensive knowledge regarding the facts of climate change, its effects and impacts, as well as the entire associated chemical effects, procedures and processes, etc., are just as unknown to the child as they are also unknown to all the idiotic demonstrators and many loudmouthed rulers. The real truth of the whole matter is of no concern to any of the idiotic demonstrators and rulers who hoot and holler and make themselves important. This is because they all, in their self-importance and egoism, do not want to admit that the whole climate disaster, which is being hysterically and violently blown up, cannot be stopped and reversed by the pathologically idiotic imbecile imaginary climate protection measures. The effective truth, which is inevitable for a long-term solution, is not taken into consideration due to the self-importance and egoism of the Earthlings, namely a worldwide controlled birth stop of several years and then a birth control of many years, because only a drastic decrease of the Earthling mass resulting from this leads to a massive decrease of all needs of humankind. This is the only manner in which to reduce environmental destruction, and thus also the destructive influences, on the atmosphere and the whole of nature and its biodiversity, or the biological diversity and number of biological and genetically visible variants of the occurring genera and species of all animals, the animal kingdom and all other living beings on land, forest, water, and air, as well as the entire plant world in every existing ecosystem, diversity, and its specific habitats. The idiotic nonsense of the climate demonstrations and the stupidly fantasized, ill-considered climate protection measures lead to unimagined adverse consequences for the peoples, because the whole thing will have an impact on the economy and on thousands of employees, which both the little girl Greta Thunberg and her backers, who make profit from the child's climate hype, did not think about it and also cannot think about it. The horrendous damage it has already created and will continue to create will also be caused by the fact that many will lose their jobs and suffer financial hardship as a result of the nonsensical, idiotic, naive climate demonstrations and their effects. And this is already happening and will continue to happen, because since the governments have also taken up the idiocy and are pushing it further, more and more nonsense measures are now being devised and enforced for everything possible under the official and state cover of climate protection. And this is happening especially through all the idiocy and the roaring hysteria of the climate demonstrators, who are demanding nonsensical measures, whereby those in power are also putting themselves in the foreground, making themselves important and making life difficult for the peoples with newly conceived taxes and other levies and fleecing them financially. Governments, organizations, business, etc. have all seized the opportunity of the whole nonsensical hysteria to not only put themselves in the foreground and make themselves important in the public eye all over the world, but also to enrich themselves. Those who are concerned in this respect, namely all the hysteria organizers involved and implicated in these criminal machinations, as well as those in power, all the demonstrators, corporations, business tycoons and others profiting from the whole hysteria, do not care about the truth, however, that only a blatant earthling reduction through a birth stop and birth regulation can solve the climate problem and bring success in the long run. Consequently, the whole climate change clamor and the circus, which serves profit and moreover misleads the peoples, is pushed on and dramatized in such a manner that fear and terror arise far and wide, spread, and ultimately bring disaster and destruction. In reality, the school children, juveniles, and adults are all demonstrating just to skip school and their jobs and to be able to shout stupidly, and make a racket and carry around nonsensical slogans and make stupid demands that would not even have an effect and would not even amount to a drop of water on a red-hot stone. All the climate demonstrators fail to recognize, grasp, and understand the stupid, idiotic, and damaging reactions produced by these moronic demonstrations, because their intelligence is insufficient and they are therefore unable to use their intellect or reason to grasp the whole issue of climate destruction and the effects of the demonstrations on those in power. Therefore, their intelligentum, or being intelligent, is not sufficient to use their intellect and reason to recognize the effective reality and truth. So, due to their lack of intelligence, they are not able to grasp that all the CO2 and laughing gases as well as methane gases, etc. that are blown out into the atmosphere, as well as all the spreading of thousands of poisons into nature, which react with each other and produce new poisonous gases, as well as the exploitation of the Earth's resources correspond to machinations that are carried out in their horrendous masses solely through the needs of the enormous massive overpopulation. So all the destruction that takes place on and to the Earth, to all waters and to all of nature, as well as in relation to the climate, is based solely on overpopulation, and this wants to live, exist, and fulfill its needs, by hook or by crook, and this also includes the creation of offspring, the procreation and birth of children. But this is exactly the sore point, because it is not thought of, because reason and rationality do not come into play and therefore sheer stupidity prevails, with boundless egoism also playing a role, that a time-related birth stop and far-reaching birth control would have to be introduced in order to drastically limit offspring. However, all the demonstrators, especially Greta Thunberg, do not have enough intelligence to recognize this fact. Consequently, their meager intelligence is also not enough to realize that every new earthling born, whether female or male, makes all the already destructive existing problems even bigger, because every new earthling also creates new problems, because new needs arise and have to be met. This makes everything worse and more destructive, also with regard to the destruction of living space and fertile soil by the earthlings themselves, because more and more land has to be built up for dwellings and various other purposes to meet the needs of the inexorably growing human race. And thus the living space of natural creatures is also completely destroyed. Sfath already predicted that the overpopulation mass will senselessly build up, destroy, and inevitably completely annihilate the best fertile land, which has really been happening for some time now and may continue in the future through compulsory expropriation. so that the living space of the Earthlings and all life in general will become ever narrower and ever more uninhabitable. And this will also happen more and more in the future due to the effects of climate destruction. If reference is made to the completely idiotic and irresponsible fears and machinations caused by Greta Thunberg, her nonsensical incitements and effects on the majority of Thunberg listeners, and everything is analyzed rationally, then the only result is a recognition of boundless stupidity in all Earthlings who take part in climate demonstrations, support them, or also only think within the Greta Thunberg framework. It does not matter how old these Thunberg-like thinkers or like-minded and like-voiced people are, whether young, juveniles, adults, or already in old age, because all of them are brainless and indoctrinated followers and incapable of using their own intellect and reason. Consequently, it is impossible for them to get to the bottom of the real reality and to grasp the effective truth of the whole climate destruction. The incitements of the naive little Greta Thunberg cause all those Earthlings of all ages who have fallen and continue to fall for her, and who are incapable of their own thinking, opinion forming and decision making, as well as of using their own intellect and reason, to be like blind chickens clucking along senselessly when another blind chicken, sitting on a ball, has laid an egg that falls down, breaks, and thus causes a smear on which the other blind chickens slip and break their bones or even their necks. What is being fabricated by the naive little Greta Thunberg with her climate theater is not only nonsense, but it also brings enormous damage to the peoples, because the governments are now using all the Thunberg crap to make financial profit from it. On the one hand, by devising nonsensical and pathologically stupid and useless as well as over-fantasized lunatic projects, which serve solely to be able to extort new tax levies, etc. from the populations. On the other hand, these state machinations lead to the fact that the perception, recognition, comprehension, and understanding of the true and fundamental problem of climate destruction is banished to the deepest darkness and not recognized. All the mendacious and misleading machinations brought about by Greta Thunberg and the resulting demonstrations, as well as the money-greedy idiotic projects of various governments, will lead to the exploitation of the people. This is because certain governments, as a result of the demonstration nonsense of the Thunberg listeners, have caught the scent of the morning air and are using the opportunity to burden the people with new taxes and all kinds of other financial charges and obligations, etc., in order to fill the state coffers, after which the money is then squandered senselessly. This, while the very own problem of climate destruction is not addressed, and neither a temporary birth stop nor controlled birth control is demanded in order to significantly reduce overpopulation in this way, because only in this way can the climate be calmed down again in the very, very long term. This is precisely why and when fewer and fewer new Earthlings are born, and humanity is brought back to a normal, reasonable number of people, through which the world climate, nature and all its fauna and flora, as well as all salt and fresh waters, the atmosphere and the air we breathe, etc., are not further poisoned and destroyed. If all life in the planet Earth, all nature and its fauna and flora, as well as the atmosphere and the climate are to be saved from a final collapse, then the entire Greta Thunberg nonsense, all Thunberg climate demonstrations as well as the dishonest, over-fantasized machinations of various governments based on and geared towards financial exploitation of the peoples, must be abandoned, and the real reality and its truth recognized, and action must be taken accordingly. This means, however, that only a controlled birth stop of several years and a very long-term worldwide birth control can solve the problems, whereby it must be clear that all that has already been finally destroyed, completely annihilated and eradicated by the desires and machinations of the insane overpopulation cannot be regenerated again and is lost for all time. As a result of the inexorable growth of humanity, everything is becoming worse and more evil in every conceivable respect. The Earthlings are steadily wasting away and becoming more and more incapable of life, becoming mentally ill en masse, even infants of only a few months. This becomes particularly noticeable in the school of the home or in kindergarten, and then even more so in schools of all kinds, but also in jobs and places of study, etc. All in all, the behavior of human beings is becoming increasingly degenerate, such as their morals, mentality and lack of interpersonal relationships, indifference, callousness and inhumanity, etc. The human beings. This is frighteningly recognizable, are effectively becoming stultified because they can no longer consciously adequately use and promote their consciousness, and thus also their world of thoughts. This results in an ever-deepening lack of learning, a lack of interest, and a rapidly growing inability to think and to grasp reality and its truth. This leads to an inner dissatisfaction and at the same time to an addiction to indeterminable subterranean desires and fulfillments, which develops into an uncontrollable, indifferent, and meaningless living in the day-to-day. This damages the function of consciousness, and thus the energy, power, and function of the intellect, or the ability and capacity as well as the use of rational thinking. In the process, the capacity for knowledge and insight is stifled, which leads to ambiguity, confusion, and erroneous ideas, and thus to weakness, powerlessness, slackening, and thus to the loss of the power of consciousness. Or stupidity, which means nothing other than a powerlessness and weakness of consciousness, which has no connection whatsoever with stupidity. But now, without further ado, I would like to talk about the following subject. In my youth, we had to sprinkle a gray powder over the stored potatoes for storage, preservation, and germ prevention. But Askett once explained to me that the powder contained certain toxins, which secreted into the potatoes and thus weakened the immune system of the human beings, and also caused diseases. Today, this powder is probably no longer used, because as far as I know, nowadays stored potatoes as well as all kinds of fruit, berries, teas, herbs and vegetables, but also meat products and various other foodstuffs, etc., are kept fresh by means of certain gases and gas chambers. However, if these are then sold and come into the normal fresh air, they quickly rot and spoil. To my knowledge, you Playaran are conducting studies on this. At least that is what your daughter Simyase once said. To this, I would now like to know whether these powders and gases are harmless today, or still as toxic and harmful to health as ever?
I can give you very good information about this, because this is one of my special fields of interest, which I am particularly concerned with, just as we on Earth also carry out intentional observations and research in this respect. Natural foodstuffs are still being treated against bacteria with poisonous powders and various poisonous gases in high-pressure storage halls at the earthly food corporations, and are thus also poisoned. Due to overpopulation and the modernization and digitalization of Earth humans, their entire way of life has changed just as adversely as their eating habits, which forces the entire economy and thus also the food industry to constantly invent new products and bring them to market. This also refers to the fact that new ways of preserving food have to be developed again and again, whereby dangerous methods that are harmful to health are invented and used. According to our research, which we carry out year after year, these are all harmful to human health and cause various malignant tumors or malignant cancers, the characteristic feature of which is an uncontrolled growth of tumor cells, whereby healthy tissue is invasively displaced and destroyed. Nonetheless, all these poisons are declared by users and health authorities to be harmless to the health of Earth humans. This, however, is a deception and a lie, because all gaseous as well as solid or powdery products of this kind cause malignant tumor diseases, and this in increasing measure and especially in the industrialized countries. The immense mass of overpopulation and its needs and desires, just in terms of food, is putting the entire food industry in distress. Because consumers are constantly demanding more and more food that is designed for convenience, use, and comfort, or food that offers correspondingly simple and labor-saving preparation and cooking. This is because, on the one hand, time is increasingly valued in terms of money and earnings, and on the other hand, because modernization and digitalization are causing the initiative and desire to work of Earth humans to decline more and more and to be extended more and more to the nonsensical use of digitalization. Digital gadgets and digital information retrieval, etc., have become a pathological addiction for the majority of Earth humans for some time now, with the result that any time spent on normal and sensible activity and on learning to live is neglected, and thus the use of intellect and reason steadily atrophies, whereby stupidity in general becomes more and more widespread and becomes a factor in life incapacity, and ultimately leads to complete incapacity to live. Because Earth humans have adjusted to need products of all kinds, which only guarantee them luxury, labor saving, laziness, and a nonsensical digital abundance, they also demand more and more food, which only needs little or no processing and no longer needs to be thoroughly cooked, but is only warmed up or already preheated and ready to eat. With all these foods, however, poisonous gases, etc., are used to preserve them on the one hand, and on the other hand to kill bacteria and immunize them against them, to the detriment of the health of the consumers, because all poisonous gases penetrate into the food and lead to all kinds of suffering and illnesses in the human body, whereby, as I have already explained, malignant tumors or various cancers are the most common ailments, which will become more and more widespread in the future. The toxic gases used against bacterial contamination in food increase the risk of health damage and also provide more space for oxidation processes, which causes food to rot and be destroyed more quickly. Chemical substances, as well as poisonous gases used to combat bacteria and preserve food, are always harmful to health, even in minimal quantities, even if health authorities and users of the gases, etc., irresponsibly claim otherwise. Oxidation in food, etc., corresponds to a chemical reaction in which an atom, ion, or molecule donates electrons, thereby increasing its oxidation number, while another substance accepts the electrons and reduces them, both reactions together corresponding to a partial reaction of a redox reaction based on an electron transfer of a chemical reaction. Nowadays, as we know from our observations and researches, the most common method used in the earthly food industry to prolong the shelf life of food is to package it under the inclusion of protective gas. It is also claimed that this gas is not harmful to health, but this is also a lie because it also penetrates the food, is toxic, and thus has a harmful effect on the human organism. So meat and fish products, etc., as well as cheese, bakery products, cut vegetables, or fruit are put into protective gas packaging, and thus consumers are deceived into thinking that everything is harmless to health. However, the food products prepared in this way by machines, packed in containers, gassed and sealed in gas-tight foils, are just as harmful to health as the gassing of foodstuffs in high-pressure storage facilities or high-pressure gas chambers. And all this also does not change the fact that an ideal gas mixture has been selected for this technology by research for each product, because they are all toxic and harmful to health and thus trigger malignant tumor diseases. Unlike solid foods, liquids are not gassed but pasteurized. So what was only used for fresh milk in earlier times is now also used for baby food and fruit juices, as well as for many other products such as fruit or vegetable purees, soups and sauces, etc. Further, depending on the product and the desire, the life is increased to a certain heat temperature, up to 120 degrees. As a rule, this temperature increase lasts only a few seconds and is then very quickly lowered again. And this is why it is done in this way in order to preserve the original aromas. After the heating for a few seconds, the products are filled in the same processing plant under sterile conditions into sterilized containers, which of course have also been debacterialized and sterilized beforehand. The high-pressure poison gas process used today is a method that requires large investments in equipment, but is extremely profitable for large companies and food corporations. This is especially so for the large companies and corporations because almost all liquid or pasty foods no longer require heating. If the food is already packed in flexible wrappings, Then it is subjected to a 7,000 bars pressure for up to 30 minutes, after which the high-pressure sterilized food tastes like fresh produce, although in reality it is no longer, but corresponds to pasteurized products that only appear deceptively fresh to consumers. If we look at other and newer technologies that are used for food preservation, they are not yet sufficiently developed, but progress is being made in their development, such as a pressure change process in which a foodstuff is mixed with an inert gas such as argon or nitrogen, which, however, are in no way non-toxic and not harmless, as is truthfully stated. This also applies to many other substances that are used for various purposes and are poisonous as well as dangerous, but which are also often used and fumigated in ship-sea containers from South America, Africa, America, and Asia, as by the following poisonous gases. 1,2-dichloroethane is a colorless, flammable, and toxic liquid with a chloroform-like odor. This chemical compound belongs to the chlorinated hydrocarbons. Poisoning by 1,2-dichloroethane occasionally occurs during the unloading of sea containers. Inert gases do not cause damage to fumigated materials during pest control, which is why the anoxia process, as it is called, is used everywhere, including in buildings, etc., and for pest control of all kinds. Argon is toxic and causes hypoxia or oxygen deficiency in the tissues of the organism when inhaled. Argon can cause a feeling of weakness, dizziness, and general malaise. Depending on the duration of an argon exposure, breathing and pulse may be accelerated. Even at low levels of stress, argon leads to shortness of breath, chest pain, trembling, sweating, alternating feelings of heat and cold, as well as a change in perception and even unconsciousness. Often quite diffuse and unspecific symptoms occur. Long-term oxygen deficiency caused by argon can lead to organ damage, which requires rapid medical clarification and treatment of the symptoms. Nitrogen is also toxic, but it is a vital basic building block of nature and a nutrient. On the other hand, it is a dangerous pollutant for Earth, humans, and ecosystems, as well as all the creatures that live in them. The main cause of reactive nitrogen emissions into all environmental media is the entire agricultural sector and thus agriculture, which, contrary to all false statistical claims by earthly expert researchers, accounts for more than 73%. Nitrogen corresponds to an inert gas, which are increasingly being used as fumigants, but even though 78% of the air we breathe consists of nitrogen, we cannot speak of a non-toxic fumigant. Nitrogen fumigation is used against insects and parasites, for example in gas-tight foil tents and enclosed chambers. If the residual oxygen content can be kept at 0.5% to 0.1%, insect eggs are killed after only 4 days to a week. If, on the other hand, the nitrogen is slowly increased and the oxygen content gradually lowered, after which it is only less than 1%. Then the insects die within 3 weeks or at most 2.5 months due to anoxia or hypoxia. In particular, the killing of insect eggs is crucial for successful fumigation. The fact that inert gases do not cause any damage to the fumigated materials during pest control does not mean that they are not harmful to the health of Earth humans. For the fact is that Earth research is still largely incapable of analyzing the dangerous toxins in these areas as well. Hydrogen cyanide or hydrogen cyanide is also a very toxic, environmentally hazardous, and highly flammable as well as deadly substance, which is absorbed very quickly through the pores of the skin when fumigated, but particularly strongly through wounds. CO2 corresponds to a gas that contains various other toxins that are still unknown to earthly research and will also remain unknown for a long time to come, because the corresponding possibilities for detecting and analyzing them will not be available for a long time yet. If fumigation of foodstuffs is carried out, as in the case of fruit and tropical fruit, etc., then sea containers and other closed containers and rooms, etc., are also included. whereby containers filled with poisonous gases through which fruit and vegetables are transported all over the world are of particular importance on the seas. However, storage rooms on land, as well as flats, halls, and churches, etc., are also fumigated to kill pests. Such gases can also delay or accelerate the ripening of foodstuffs, especially apples and bananas, which secrete the phytohormone ethene or ethylene and CO2 during ripening. Adding CO2 delays ripening, while adding ethene stimulates ripening. But this toxic CO2 also gets into the fruit, which is then eaten and damages the health of Earth humans. This is especially true with regard to malignant tumor diseases, which are particularly caused and promoted by CO2. If the ripening of fruits is desired, then ethene is released without hesitation in order to bring them to ripeness more quickly and in a more controlled manner. Ethene or ethylene is also produced by plants themselves and also acts like a plant hormone in relation to an artificially induced and rapid ripening process. Above all, it is used for the ripening of apples, bananas, and tomatoes because it already acts in nanomolecular quantities. Fruits are often prevented from ripening by nitrogen when this is delayed by negative pressure and the resulting withdrawal of ethene. The inhalation of fumigants causes various health complaints in Earth humans after only a short time, and this is also the case with exposures or vapors in grain stores. Carbon dioxide is also used irresponsibly in large quantities to delay ripening, which might also cause the necessary displacement of oxygen in the storage rooms, but which also makes entering them life-threatening because there is a risk of suffocation in fumigated rooms. Hydrogen phosphide pH3 is another colorless gas that smells like garlic or fish and is also toxic to health. It is used both commercially and in the private sector. In its pure state, the substance is very toxic, corrosive, dangerous to the environment, and highly self-igniting. Nevertheless, it is also claimed that this gas is not harmful to health, which is not true because this substance also contains toxic basic substances that have a harmful effect on health, but which cannot be detected or analyzed by earthly means. However, hydrogen phosphide can be formed in the body from aluminium or magnesium phosphide, which are not usually recognized as dangerous when ingested orally, but over time lead to damage to health, whereby symptoms of poisoning can still occur after 24 to 48 hours, but which may be difficult to analyze as harmful effects of hydrogen phosphide. Among other things, hydrogen phosphide can form in grain stores when moisture spreads, but it can also penetrate masonry due to its small molecular size. Furthermore, this substance can cause a blockage in important fermentation processes in the human body and also permanent kidney or liver damage. If the concentration in the blood is very high, methemoglobin can be formed, but the consequence can be a very dangerous respiratory dysfunction. Acute poisoning or subacute poisoning with nausea and faintness caused by this substance is possible, as is sudden death. Oils and ferrous substrates are being tested for the destruction of parasites, and various newer methods are also being used and researched, as we can observe. But it would be going too far to say more about this. I just want to say that in the future, in addition to the products, the packaging is also to be treated, whereby essential oils as well as ferrous substrates or antimicrobial solutions are being considered, which are incorporated into packaging films and then released into the food during storage and are to protect it. Whereby, however, as we have already researched, all these substances will also have an adverse effect on the health of the Earth humans. In modern times, toxic gaseous substances are generally used as fumigants for foodstuffs, which are also used to kill bacteria and other pests in buildings, rooms, and containers, or the supplies or materials stored in them. These poisonous and sometimes very poisonous gases and other substances, which are occasionally also used in combination, have properties and dangers that can cause damage to the health of Earth humans and even endanger their lives. If the fumigants are used to fumigate stored goods that are not moved and thus rid them of mites, insects, and other undesirable creatures, the gases are distributed between and around the foodstuffs, the toxins of the gases also penetrating into their interior. This is to meet the requirements of quality and pest-free, as well as the properties of low residue formation in dehydrated stocks and good penetrating ability. In this respect, gaseous as well as solid pesticides are used in special closed rooms, but also in the open field. 1-methylcyclopropene MCP has only a low toxicity, but is nevertheless harmful to health because it is already effective in the smallest doses, and thus also only leads to extremely low residues of less than 0.01 ppm. Contrary to other claims, it is just as carcinogenic, mutagenic, and reproductively harmful as all other toxins in solid or gaseous form. Basically, it has undetectable effects on ozone, earth, air, and water organisms in low doses and by earthly means for a long time to come. In ignorance of earthly chemical research, 1-methylcyclopropene is used worldwide without hesitation for apple treatment. With regard to the storage of pome fruit, only low concentrations of about 1 ppm note Billy. ppm = parts per million are used for fumigation in the storage atmosphere, whereby the respiratory activity of the fruit is reduced by the occupation of its ethylene receptors, and the ripening process is significantly slowed down. However, this technique does not allow consumers to tell the age of the fruit, making it impossible for consumers to distinguish whether the fruit is fresh, a few days, weeks, or even 2 or 3 years old. Aging can only be detected by chemical analysis, as also by the fact that the vitamin C content drops, which is degraded by aging. Sulfuryl fluoride, another very toxic and environmentally hazardous fumigant for objects, is almost inert and colorless. It is also non-flammable, odorless, and heavier than air. Sulfuryl fluoride is used to combat wood, textile, and other material pests. Bromomethane, that is to say methyl bromide, is mainly used on wood against molds and wood pests. However, this substance is extremely toxic and very dangerous to the environment, with a bromomethane concentration of more than 2 g per cubic meter in a closed room already having a lethal effect.
Thank you. Now that was an interesting monologue on your part, and all your explanations are very interesting. I just had the idea that I could use your remarks for a Ratgeber edition. Ratgeber Advice Advisor is a regular FIGU publication.
I have no objection to that, but I will first address your question, which you put to me yesterday and which I had to look up in my father's separate annals in order to clarify. The records show that Father Zimmerman on the one hand concealed his contact with my father, Sfath, you and Professor Jung from his entire family, as was also the case with your 2 teachers, Graf and Lehman. Without your knowledge and without the knowledge of his family, Pastor Zimmerman arranged a collaboration with Professor Jung, both of whom, together and with the help of teacher Graf, translated your prediction into English in 1949. My father investigated and worked out the presidencies of the USA, namely their 10, by means of advance visits of the period from 1950 to 2000, for which purpose your prediction. Completed by the 3 of them, that is to say, Pastor Zimmerman, Professor Jung, and teacher Graf into the English language, was closed and sealed in 10 individual document packets. These were then provided with the full names and addresses of all U.S. presidents in office from 1950 to the year 2000, as they had been fathomed by my father Sfath through time-forward visits. He was then also responsible, which I only found out today from my father's annals, for the 10 copies reaching the White House in the USA, where they were hidden away as a special secret matter for all presidents, with the involvement of the then President Harry S. Truman, who resided in 1953. However, his memory regarding the secret stash and contact with my father was then erased.
So Sfath had been in direct contact with Harry Truman.
That's according to my father's annals.
But how was it then that the whole incident was erased from Truman's memory?
Explaining this would require lengthy explanations, which, however, would go too far and explain facts that I am not allowed to state openly. First, however, it must be explained that the erasure of the relevant memory factors was not forced, but was done with the consent of President Truman. However, I can and may only point out that my father proceeded in 3 steps, the first of which was neuroscientific, in which President Truman himself made an active effort to erase his memory. On the one hand, this occurred as a result of my father's influence of speech, whereby Truman so reshaped, altered, and removed his mental context from his memory itself that he was no longer aware of, and thus erased the whole incident relating to the contact with my father and the hiding of the secret matter. The second step took place in a post-hypnotic manner in order to remove the whole thing as a memory for a long time. But the third step in this context consisted of a co-application of xenon gas, whereby the specific biographical thing that occurred lapsed into amnesia and was thus erased.
Interesting. But something you should tell me more about later if you cannot be open about it now. But another question. How then did the 10 sealed big letters get into the hands of the respective presidents?
These were stored as secret matters for the presidents only, and accessible only to them, with a note that this matter could only be passed on by one president to the next, and that silence had to be maintained about it. As we have undoubtedly been able to ascertain, this also actually happened until 1989, when George H.W. Bush was appointed as the 41st President of the United States of America. The latter destroyed his copy and that of the next president. Consequently, he did not hand it over to his successor, which he should have done. My father was concerned that all future presidents should receive your predictions by the year 2000, and so it also happened that every U.S. president in his time actually received his due copy. Or rather, that everyone was given his due copy, and everyone could take note of the contents, but none of them did anything to create benefit for the world from it.
So there was a secret hiding place in the White House. I can understand that. But I am still puzzled as to how, over time, the individual presidents were able to get the sealed predictions out of the hiding place and pass them on, how they got hold of them in the first place. So they must have known about the hiding place.
No, that was not the case, because my father used a technique that is common among us, which can be directed or programmed to certain mental swinging waves, so that certain persons who emit these swinging waves are strongly urged to perform a certain action, and then, when that which is necessary has been done, forget everything again. And such a device, small in its dimensions, he programmed with the mental swinging waves of all 10 presidents he had ever analyzed at their time in office up to the year 2000. Consequently, it turned out that all U.S. presidents after Truman until 1989, until Ronald Reagan, fulfilled everything according to the programming, but none of them used the predictions to address and carry out anything positive. In 1993, George H.W. Bush was voted out of office after only 4 years in office, which caused him to fly into a rage, which resulted when he was influenced by the swinging waves of my father's device, and he found the secret hiding place and read in the written request and the prediction, that he lost his temper, went into a fit of rage, and completely destroyed everything.
Aha, so that's how it was. Your father Sfath already said of this Bush that he was a raving lunatic and also a coward, or rather he says today that he was a coward. Sfath said at the time that Bush had been a photographer pilot in 1944 or so, and had been quite loud-mouthed, but that he had abandoned 3 of his fellow pilots in an air battle and simply sent them to their deaths while he had run away. He did not care about the deaths of his 3 pilot comrades, but he still made a big show of himself as a hero everywhere, for which he also received military awards of honor, etc.
This is known to me from our very numerous war records, which have been made by us during all wars and other weapons engagements on Earth since time immemorial, which are broadcast to all our worlds and Federation members as information, which has a general deterrent effect with regard to acts of war and terrorism.
Yes, I know that, for already Sfath has informed me of this.
What do you actually not know, and what are you not all informed about, my friend?
It is just some things, but it is not that I know everything, and therefore I do not have to ask you about this and that. So I am not omniscient. I'm just a small, insignificant, tiny sausage of knowledge in the whole gear of omniscience. And that is also the case with you, Playarin, and that too when I know a few things which I had to conceal from you as a result of a promise made to your father, Sfath. And on the one hand, this had nothing to do with mistrust, just as on the other hand, I did not want to deceive you or stand above you. It is?
Excuse me, Edward, dear friend. Neither I nor any of us ever thought or assumed anything like that. With regard to my person, I was simply perplexed and thrown out of balance of my concept when I became aware of all that you knew and know more, in some respects, than I and all of us who.
It's all right, dear friend. We really do not need to talk about that, because the whole thing is settled. So please, let us not talk about it anymore, but maybe talk about the fact that in today's...
Then I want to interrupt you, excuse me, and go back to the previous topic, namely the predictions that were made available to the presidents of the USA by my father. These presidents were not the only ones, because your predictions were sent worldwide to all government offices of all states on Earth at that time. And in this respect, Professor Jung also acted of his own accord, for he was acquainted at that time with 6 federal councilors of Switzerland. And to them he also sent everything. And according to my father's records, these were the following names: Karl Kobelt, Rodolphe Roubaudel, Max Petitpierre, Ernst Nobes, Enrico Celio, and Eduard von Steiger. Now I will come straight to what we started talking about just now, namely that since we have known each other you have often asked questions, also to my daughter Simya-Se and to Quetzal, etc., for which you already knew the facts, and thus also the answers, and better than we did. For example, with regard to unknown flying objects, as I could read from the annals of my father Sfath. I also know now that my father instructed you to act towards us and the Earth humans as if you had no knowledge in this respect. Consequently, you should pretend to be ignorant, which you really did in such a manner that none of us noticed that you already knew the facts and also the answers before we.
Excuse me, I did not want to mislead you with that, as I said earlier, because Sfath instructed me at that time that I should do that. On the one hand, if it was with you just now, to find out to what extent you are really seriously dealing with and mastering the task that you have taken on and are carrying out. But this was only a part of the whole, something I had to do until you yourself would come and speak of it. Because then, through the annals of your father Sfath, if you had studied them, you would come to the crux of the matter yourself and ask me. That is what you did just now. So that far, then from my side is also the other, and that is that on the other hand I am not allowed to speak openly in the future either, so that it does not get out to the public, whereas we can discuss everything among ourselves without hesitation, which we can do, however, in only purely private conversations.
Yes, I have learned all this from the annals, and therefore I also know that you would not have maintained our contacts if you had not done justice to your task. Besides, however, there is something unclear about this, for my father, Sfath, left no record of what the purpose of this action was supposed to be, though he noted that you would explain this when the time came. To this end, he enclosed a sealed document at the beginning of his annals, noting that I am to deliver this to you unopened in the 9th month in 2019, and that only you are authorized to open it. I found this first in the annals of my father Sfath years ago, and have kept it carefully to bring it to you now. And in addition, I think that you had knowledge of it, but until today you have never mentioned anything about it, and all this time you have kept silent and pretended to be ignorant. And you have done this for about 66 years from the time of my father's departure, as well as after Ascot appeared in 1953, up to the present time. But during all this time we did not notice that you had your facial expressions under control, in such a manner that we did not recognize your facial expressions as consciously intended. Consequently, we misinterpreted your confident movements of your facial surface and just your whole facial expression, and the individual facial facets of the movements of your facial musculature.
I did not want to trick you or deceive you with my behavior, but I simply did not want to let you know that my questions were simply for the purpose of finding out something that was destined to end our contacts or to maintain them for the rest of my life. All this never had anything to do with acting, because I am too dumb for that and perhaps even daft, because I do not want to and cannot pretend in this manner, because I would feel quite asinine if I had to act. Simply pretending to be ignorant and controlling my facial expressions accordingly, that is something else and has nothing to do with acting, because by doing so I would lose control of my facial muscles and probably turn bright red in the face. This is what actually happened to me once in my youth, when I was in the Faltigberg lung sanatorium at a height above Wald in the Tostal for 8 months as a result of TB or tuberculosis. At that time, although I did not want to and against my will, I had to take part in a nativity play at Christmas in a hall full of people, and I had to play one of the 3 wise men. I felt more than just silly and stupid, and my head and face were so hot that I had the feeling I was going to burn. In addition, I had also forgotten to take the gift that was lying in the changing room, and that I should have given to Joseph, so I could only hold out my empty hand to him. Well, it was good that in our contact conversations over the years, I asked you certain questions as instructed by Sfath, the answers to which I actually already knew through learning from your father Sfath, but pretended to know little or nothing about them. I did this simply because your father taught me, and asked me to behave in this manner towards you for a certain period of years, for a good reason. This time was a kind of journeyman's test for me in connection with you, because I was not allowed to let on anything, and only through this could I experience for myself that I was really capable of keeping silent about everything I had to keep silent about. In certain respects, this is also what I have been ordered to do until the end of my life, as a result of which I also have to do it, also with regard to various knowledge that relates to the unknown flying objects that are repeatedly observed and talked about around the world. Basically, everything was always connected with the fact that I had to learn and make the experience of my own personal experience under all circumstances, to keep silent about many things, facts and events, etc., that were never or for a certain time not allowed to be mentioned, not allowed to be told, and not allowed to be made public. So he imposed on me the task that after his departure, I also had to examine myself and therefore had to practice my journeyman's piece of silence towards other human beings, whereby you, that is to say, first Ascot, then your daughter Simya say, you and Quetzal were the persons who, according to Sfatha's instruction, came into consideration for me in the first place in order to practice my art of silence. For if you had found that I was simply feigning and pretending ignorance against my better knowledge, then I would have failed and would not have been able to undertake my task. And that was already certain when Ascot and then also Simyase came, because Sfath made it a condition for me that, under all circumstances, I had to keep all the secrets entrusted to me by him to the Earthlings, and also complete my journeyman's piece of silence, also with you. And if I had not done this and betrayed myself to you, then you would have had to erase all my knowledge of the secrets taught to me by Sfath, in respect of which I had to remain silent to all Earthlings and must also continue to do so on the whole. And for this purpose, as I have now explained everything to you, your father Sfath taught me to master facial expressions as a part of my expressive behavior, as well as to become capable of forming my behavior, actions and gestures, and above all also my perception of responsibility, correctly, so that through nonverbal communication I never betray anything that must not be betrayed. This means that even without speech and language, that is to say only through gestures, facial expressions, or optical signs, nothing is recognized, and no knowledge is conveyed. In fact, facial expression is essentially based on the contraction, that is to say the constriction of the mimic musculature, which is particularly determined by the eyes and the mouth. And it is these most mobile parts of the face that, as Sfath explained to me, can produce almost 3,500 modifications, which, as Sfath clearly said, seem like an open book to connoisseurs and experts, as you also are. And that you have these abilities, I have experienced and learned. And that is why all the years of our conversations have caused me a great deal of trouble and cost me many a self-weariness when I caught myself in an imprudence that could have betrayed me. But if I now break the seal and open this document, then you can read it, ascertain and find confirmed, dear friend, what I have just explained. And what else is contained in it of certain indications, etc., as your father explained to me when he wrote the writing, I can only interpret to you in private.
It is always astonishing to me, but I am used to a lot of things with you, but now I would like to...
Of course, now just read what your father has written.
It is strange to me also this, what
you want to ask, I know, my friend. For there is another aspect I must explain to you. Your father Sfath was always a little worried, and that is because he could not teach you and your descendants and also Quetzal personally, but only through his annals and familiarize you with your task here on the earth. This is precisely because, consequently, he could only introduce you through his annals to the realities of the danger that exists for you with regard to the earthlings. Consequently, he was often concerned that through some circumstances you might be influenced by the earthling energies of faith and suffer harm and revert to certain behaviors of your early ancestors if you somehow came into conflict with your directives through influence. During his lifetime, he himself, as also his father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, and also your great-great-grandfather Hylock and others, endeavored to avoid this. That is why he instructed me that I should already send you certain information which ask it delivered to you, from which you could learn and use certain necessary things for yourselves, which prevented unpleasant things from happening, and through which you also occupied yourselves with things, to which I then asked questions, the answers to which were regarded as proof to me that everything was going the right way. The longer, the more I realized that your father's misgivings were unnecessary, for you adhere so strictly to your directives, as you have done for over 52,000 years, and thereby preserve everything that was then triggered by the swinging waves of the sphere and led to what you are and exist and maintain today in peace, freedom, and righteousness. And now, as to all else that is written, that concerns, however, dear friend, we shall have to talk about that at another time.
Thank you. Now I also understand that all of us who met you and work with you perceive you as our real friend, and feel that friendship in deep connection.
Thank you. Good. We do not need to talk about that any further, I think. But thank you very much. Then we can finish the topic and you can answer my question about the gases.
Yes, but later I would like to talk to you about some things, but it should not be official then. On the gases, if I am to speak of them now, they are indeed not harmless to the health of Earth humans, for these also contain harmful toxins like the earlier powders you mentioned. These toxins penetrate all the products you mentioned, and they also damage the immune system and also cause various ailments and diseases, especially various types of cancer.
Does this also apply to organic foods, which are so highly praised because fewer toxins are added to them than to normal commercially produced foods such as potatoes, fruits, berries, vegetables, teas, and herbs? As far as I know, organic food is also sprayed against weeds and fungi, etc., with copper.
The difference is only in the production, because in organic food less toxins are added than in normal commercially produced food, as you call it. And if organic food is preserved for a certain period of time in food freshness chambers by means of gases, then it is also contaminated by the gas toxins and becomes a health hazard for many human beings, just like the normal, commercially produced natural food of all kinds. In fact, organic products cannot be produced without the use of copper, which is why organic farmers also spray their fields and gardens with copper solutions, which are generally considered harmless and not dangerous to health. But this is not the case. Although an adult human being needs about 1 to 1.5 milligrams of copper daily, if human beings have an increased intake of copper over a longer period of time, be it through food or otherwise through the environment, this leads to copper poisoning. Although copper is a trace element for human beings that performs vital functions in the body and is indispensable for the production of energy by the cells with oxygen or for cell respiration, the smallest amounts are sufficient for the body, whereas too much copper damages the organism. There are various sources in the environment that release copper and can lead to long-term exposure in human beings, and thus to copper poisoning. This can be caused, for example, by an elevated copper level in tap water, as can result from the use of old copper pipes, but also by copper-containing fungicides and pesticides used in horticulture and agriculture, which is common in much of agriculture. What also needs to be taken into account in terms of increased exposure to copper is the consumption of tobacco products and working in factories that process copper. Depending on the situation, too high copper levels in organic products can also lead to serious health hazards. Excessive levels of copper in the human organism lead to long-lasting ailments and diseases, such as joint inflammations like arthritis or inflammations of the respiratory tract, prostate, and digestive tract. Excessive copper levels, however, also lead to high blood pressure. Excessive copper levels also increase the risk of heart attack and also lead to liver metabolism disorders. However, this is not enough to mention, because an increased copper level also leads to the increased formation of free radicals, which in human beings causes mood disorders, just as too much copper in the organism also increases epileptic disorders, causes pathological depression, and various nervous disorders. Similar symptoms also appear in the hereditary disease Wilson's disease, because the function of the copper transport proteins is disturbed, thus preventing the excretion of copper. Animals and livestock, as well as poultry and birds, etc., also suffer health damage from copper excess. Because copper intoxication above 250 to 300 ppm leads to liver cell death in them, although these normally remain asymptomatic and are also regenerative. From 850 to 900 ppm. However, intoxications lead to irreversible liver cell death, enter the blood and lead to intravascular hemolysis or dissolution of the red blood cells by leakage of the red blood pigment due to the effect of blood toxins, which further results in prehepatic jaundice or hyperbilirubinemia, a yellowing of the skin, eyes, mucous membranes, and internal organs. Excess copper is normally excreted by the kidneys but leads to nephrosis of deposits in the kidneys. In the central nervous system, on the other hand, too much or too little copper leads to demyelination or degenerative destruction of the myelin sheaths of the axons of the CNS or PNS and central deficits such as ataxia. These explanations should suffice.
Thought so?
English translation, 725th contact. Part 2. Saturday, the 12th of October 2019, 23:58 hours.
Then something else. Cryonics, that is to say cryostasis. That is to say the freezing of human beings for alleged reawakening was already talked about years ago and explained that the whole thing was complete nonsense and pure money-making.
That is also actually the case, because the whole thing is nonsense beyond compare and serves the sole purpose of financial exploitation of those Earth humans whose intellect and reason as a whole cannot be used as a result of a delusion, at least with regard to the ineffectiveness and impossibility of cryonics.
Yes, that was the same answer at the time. Now I've done some research and learned a few things, so I'd like to ask another time what you have to say about euthanasia, which is legal in Switzerland and prohibited in other countries. Which is why people who want to die come to Switzerland from all over the world and have themselves killed with poison, like lethal doses of sodium pentobarbital. In Switzerland, active euthanasia is regulated in Article 114 of the Swiss Penal Code and prohibits killing on demand. Assisted suicide, which is also called assisted AS or suicide, is also permitted under certain conditions. Legal and ethical guidelines exist in the context of assisted suicide, which regulate the procedure in different places. Well, here in Switzerland, as far as I know, there are several organizations that transport human beings to the afterlife by means of so-called assisted suicide. I know some of them by name, such as Exit, Dignitas, Eternal Spirit, and Pegaso Swiss Association, and X International. In my opinion, assisted suicide, which is also called assisted suicide and assisted suicide associations, which practice direct active euthanasia, as is legally permitted in Switzerland, corresponds to a lucrative legally sanctioned murder business, which corresponds to a Swiss peculiarity and is only possible according to the Penal Code Article 115 StGB. This article stipulates that assisted suicide is only punished if it is carried out for selfish reasons. If there is no selfishness, or if it is defined precisely in the real sense of greed, or if it cannot be proven, then the assisted suicide will not be punished. Idiotically, it is understood that assisted suicide is permitted if there are only ethical, humane, but not greedy, and above all, no commercial reasons. However, it is almost impossible to prove this, to find out what really lies behind assisted suicide. In Switzerland, active euthanasia is regulated in Article 114 of the Swiss Penal Code StGB, and prohibits killing on demand. Assisted suicide, on the other hand, is permitted under certain conditions, as formulated in Article 115 of the StGB. In the context of assisted suicide, there are other legal and ethical provisions that regulate the procedure in different places. The description of legally permitted assisted suicide, as the whole thing is called, is, however, a joke when viewed and understood correctly, because assisted suicide is just as much killing on demand and thus murder as when one human being kills another human being for any other reason, be it by shooting, beating to death, etc., or as executioners work in relation to a legally ordered execution, etc., at that time. In 1937, when this lunacy law was incorporated into the Swiss Penal Code, there was a strong feeling among all those of the Swiss population who supported and accepted this aberrant law, as is also the case today among all those who support it, who advocate this law and the murder of human beings by euthanasia as right and good, as worthy of human beings and the free will of human beings. Obviously a pathologically stupid attitude and morality, and an effectively degenerate, ethical, inhumane, callous, jaded, and unscrupulous state of mind prevailed. The whole thing reflects a miserable and stoically hardened state of consciousness among human beings who at that time obviously lived in a state of mind-blurred attitudes and morality, and in the delusion that the murder of human beings was right when they were administered a deadly poison, and that they had to be exempted from prosecution because this kind of murder only brought about good for all parts. This, for example, in such a way that if a man maltreats his wife and she wants to kill herself because of it, he beats her unconscious, puts her on a chair when she wakes up, puts a rope around her neck and ties it to a beam high above her, and then leaves her standing half-stunned until she collapses powerlessly, falls off the chair, and hangs herself. And that's the end of the story because she ultimately kills herself by losing her strength to stand, falling, and dying from the rope. And people who practice euthanasia or simply advocate it are obviously either religious, sectarian, delusional believers, possibly haters of human beings, or creatures who take pleasure and delight in watching mentally ill and disturbed human beings die miserably because they want to, and because it is their right to self-determination. Euthanasia is just like the executioners who consciencelessly and murderously execute human beings, and afterwards cheerfully feast on delicious meals and drinks and thanks to their horrendous blood money, can live a long life in joy, luxury, glory, and completely unconcerned until old age, in order to one day bite the dust completely normally and unpunished. And this is also what certain people of these euthanasia associations and euthanasia organizations do in the same way. Namely, those who profit from the whole thing, be it as a result of their blood money profit, or in terms of the fulfillment of their desire to be able to feast and enjoy the suffering and death of others. At that time, in 1937, when this lunatic law was enacted by imbeciles, callous, unconscionable, and irresponsible people from the Swiss population, they acted just as irresponsibly as before, when the death penalty was still imposed and carried out. And since I am always concerned about this murder, I see and understand the whole thing as murder. Because if a human being is given a deadly poison to drink, or by simply making it available to him so that he can take it, even if he does it voluntarily, then this is an act that corresponds to murder. And this for the reason that a human being who resolutely wants to commit suicide is no longer capable of his senses, and consequently can no longer use his intellect and reason, which is why he needs professional psychological help. This is in order to reawaken the values of his personal instinct of self-preservation, life preservation instinct and life responsibility in himself, to build them up again in himself, and to let them become effective, no matter why he has destroyed them in himself through any circumstances. It does not matter whether this destruction is due to suffering, infirmity, old age, grief, illness, fear or cowardice before life or before the future, etc. In any case, as I see it, suicide corresponds to a cowardice of life, and this is also the case when the human being somehow allows himself to be killed or murdered by a murderer, even in the manner of a murderer. This is also the case when the human being allows himself to be killed or murdered by a murderer, also in the manner practiced by the various euthanasia associations in Switzerland, which in recent years have sent to their death 750 to 850 times a year today around 1,000 human beings who have no instinct for self-preservation and are therefore mentally ill and incapable of making their own decisions, and who would have needed professional psychological care to regain the courage to live. In my opinion, however, this was deliberately omitted, because the human beings who were catapulted out of life with lethal poisons certainly had no expert and effectively fundamental psychological counseling, but were only subjected to superficial pseudo-psychological palaver, which was ultimately designed for suicide, which will probably continue to be the case. For my part, I looked around the internet on Wikipedia and found the following regarding these suicide association organizations, which you can read here.
Tha reads.
In the meantime, 5 organizations, at least known to a wider public, are courting those willing to commit suicide. The best known, and by far the largest organization, is Exit, which began operations in 1982 as the Association for Humane Dying. One of the founding personalities was the Bernese teacher Hedwig Zerker, who 17 years later, terminally ill, put an end to her life with Exit. As a first step, Exit introduced the living will, and in 1984, the first assisted suicides began. Also in 1982, Exit ADMD Association pour le droit de mourir dans la dignité was founded in Geneva. The two associations, Exit Deutsche Schweiz and Exit Romandie, see themselves as independent sister organizations. In 1998, the feisty and charismatic Zurich lawyer Ludwig A. Manelli resigned as an Exit member to considerable fanfare. Shortly afterwards, Manelli, who had also made a name for himself as a journalist and the first Swiss correspondent of Der Spiegel, founded the association Dignitas Menschenwürdig Leben, Menschenwürdig Sterben, Dignitas, Living with Dignity, Dying with Dignity, together with his daughter. Standpunkt assisted suicide. The numbers speak for the seriousness of the organizations. Assisted suicide in Switzerland does not take place in a legal vacuum, writes Jörg Weiler of Exit. By Jörg Weiler, since 2014, the assisted suicide organization Eternal Spirit in Basel-Landschaft has made assisted suicide possible. Thanks to the death of the 104-year-old Australian botanist, David Goodall, which was celebrated with surprisingly little media criticism, the foundation gained international publicity in spring 2018. Goodall, I am not sick, died in Lystal on the 10th of May 2018 from poison ingestion. His last complaint was that it took a long time for death to occur. The Eternal Spirit Foundation was founded by the former Dignitas Cohesion doctor Erica Preissig, who also presides over the Life Circle Association, which pursues the same goal. According to her own information, she has made assisted suicide possible for 600 human beings. There is also the assisted suicide organization X International. In 2014, the association Liberty Life Today LL Exit was founded in the canton of Ticino. Remarkably, those who want to participate in the death market do not need an official permit or license. Death tourism to Switzerland repeatedly makes headlines worldwide. Going to Switzerland is a catchphrase in England. In the novel Map and Territory by the French star author Michel Houellebecq, Dignitas makes a bizarre cameo appearance. The main character, Jed, beats up an employee of the euthanasia organization because she had accompanied his father to his death. Company patron Ludwig A. Manelli did what he always does in such situations. He sued the publisher, but in vain. Houellebecq, in an interview with the Frankfurter Rundschau, I am against Dignitas because assisted suicide is murder, that's all. The Wunderkind of German literature, Daniel Kellmann, also describes in his novel Room how his protagonist travels to Zurich to die. On the train ride, however, she realizes that this moment has not yet come. For a foreigner, assisted suicide costs around 10,000 Swiss francs. In order not to expose itself to the accusation of business activity, that is to say, a selfish motive, Dignitas invests in a suicide forum that gives those tired of life the opportunity to exchange ideas on the internet, which certainly does not serve as a deterrent, as a counterpart to the Dargebotenhand, so to speak. Thanks to Martin Walser's novel A Dying Man, this also received literary consecration. For all these efforts, Ludwig A. Manelli, the self-proclaimed fighting machine, pays himself an average annual salary of around 160,000 francs. In 2017, Exit accompanied 734, the competitor associations Dignitas 222, and Eternal Spirit 73 human beings to their death. Roughly speaking, almost 3 persons died every day in Switzerland through assisted suicide. And the trend is rising. Asked quite banally, is this normal? Or to put it another way, is the desire to die really so high in the richest country on earth? Much higher than in poorer countries? While human beings in other cultures and countries are struggling for bare survival and trying to get to Europe by all possible means, our assisted suicide organizations, in their own words, are already keeping waiting lists because they can no longer meet the need for assisted suicide. Nevertheless, criticism in Switzerland is surprisingly mild. Assisted suicide now seems to be as much a part of Swiss DNA as Toblerone or the Matterhorn. Not even death tourism from abroad, as practiced exclusively by Dignitas and Eternal Spirit, causes any great stir in this country. This may also be due to the fact that a certain habituation effect has set in, and the topic has lost some of its drama since assisted suicide is no longer practiced in residential areas. Assisted suicide organization looking for Housing Switzerland as the last destination. More and more seriously ill human beings from abroad are coming to Switzerland to die here. But for the 2 popular initiatives calling for a ban on euthanasia and death tourism in the canton of Zurich were rejected in 2011 by 78.4% and 84.5% respectively. For the advocates of assisted suicide, this was a clean note of health to legitimize the whole business model. For Exit CEO Bernhard Sutter, anyone who still objects to this is a religious fundamentalist. Neither the state nor the church has a say in dying, Sutter told the Swiss news agency SDA after the vote. Despite everything, it seems grotesque that a country that punishes every parking offense and every speeding offense with considerable fines leaves the existential question of all, namely that of one's own life, to highly controversial practitioners and angels of death. Like, for example, Dignitas founder Ludwig A. Manelli, who also grants juveniles the right to suicide, or the former Exit president and death ideologist Pastor Werner Creasy, who makes the radical demand that elderly human beings should also be able to obtain the lethal sodium pentobarbital without a medical diagnosis, and as a long-term goal even without a prescription. This is in the sense of the personal right to self-determination. Against such a desire, American gun legislation seems, to put it a little cynically, almost draconian. It is, in the best sense of the word, higher irony that the Swiss euthanasia pioneers not only have an advanced age, but also an enviable vitality. Exit co-founder Rolf Sigg turned 100, Ludwig A. Manelli and Werner Creasy are also well over 80. What they all have in common, they themselves have surprisingly little desire to die. And perhaps it is also easier to philosophize about the right to one's own death when it does not concern one. The motive that led to art. 115 STGB more than 80 years ago was undoubtedly, note Billy, justified at the time. Nevertheless, the question should be allowed whether the whole death industry, as it is practiced today, still corresponds to this basic idea. Should everything really be allowed? Don't human beings sometimes have to be protected from themselves? The decision to choose suicide is a final one. Assisted suicide, as provided for in the law, is based on the premise that all those involved are acting exclusively from noble motives. But who can guarantee that this is always the case? Foreign legislators probably also had their reasons when they banned assisted suicide. The Swiss euthanasia organization's practice assisted dying only in the presence of a medical diagnosis and certification of the client's capacity to judge. Theoretically, young, healthy human beings may also be accompanied to their death, writes Exit on its homepage. But it is aware of the great responsibility and adheres not only to Swiss law and the corresponding case law, but also to the additional criteria of the Exit statutes, internal guidelines, and an agreement with the Exit location Canton of Zurich, according to which assisted suicide may be used only for human beings with a hopeless prognosis, unbearable pain, or unreasonable disability. Reading this, the circle of those who fulfill the prerequisite for assisted suicide narrows down massively. Although theoretically possible, it is not customary even in Switzerland for young, healthy human beings to be accompanied to their death. But for radical death ideologists, this maxim is also no longer taboo. The association Echtes Recht auf Leben auf Selbstbestimmung Eras from Gossau dragged the Zurich authorities all the way to the federal Supreme Court because in 2015 their cantonal doctor had not responded to the request that a lethal dose of sodium pentobarbital could also be prescribed to healthy human beings and also refused to initiate proceedings. The highest Swiss court recognized the explosive effect of this demand and ruled in favor of the Zurich authorities. This case shows in an exemplary way that the state, which should actually be responsible for the lives of its citizens, feels itself exposed to ever more radical demands by the ideologists of dying. Criticism of assisted suicide in Switzerland is mostly frowned upon. Abroad, this is different. In France, For example, the request of 74-year-old Jacqueline Jonquel, who wants to end her life with the help of the assisted suicide organization Life Circle in San and Bern in January 2020, despite her blinding health, is met with incomprehension. Especially as Jacqueline Jonquel wants to exploit her planned departure in the media with a press tour and a documentary film. Euthanasia, the state cannot force anyone to live against their will. Older, still healthy, and leaving life with euthanasia? Interview with ethicist Alberto Bondolfi by Katie Romy. It is probably a Swiss peculiarity that in this country, in order not to expose oneself to the general suspicion of being a backwoods mountain people, one behaves in a particularly liberal and also radical manner. Regardless of all reservations, assisted suicide, with over 1,000 cases a year, has long since become a business model with well-rehearsed procedures. This raises the question of whether the individual providers are not also subject to entrepreneurial pressure. Or, to put it a little more bluntly, is a blind eye not sometimes turned in the medical pre-assessment of individual candidates willing to die, either to accommodate the client or also to achieve the operational goals of the assisted suicide organization? Actually, after every extraordinary death, the police or the public prosecutor's office should be called in to clarify at the place of death whether the situation found corresponds to the information given by the assisted dying person and whether the necessary formalities, such as the examination of the deceased's capacity to judge, have been seriously observed. But this is theory. The Zurich Public Prosecutor's Office, according to its own information, usually no longer intervenes in cases of assisted suicide, such as those carried out by the assisted dying organizations known to it. Instead, after the deed has been done, one or two police officers and the public health officer visit the place of death. But their investigation is only of a formal nature. According to the prosecuting authority, it is not at all a matter of discovering ambiguities, but rather of clarifying whether there is a punishable third-party culpability, that is to say, homicide or even murder. However, this is relatively rare according to the Zurich Public Prosecutor's Office, and in practice it is also extremely difficult to clarify as there are no witnesses left. Assisted suicide, how Dignitas proselytizes for assisted suicide abroad. Some Swiss organizations are politically and legally engaged in other countries to legalize assisted suicide worldwide. By Sibylla Bondolfi. The decisive question, however, whether there had been money flows, that is to say legacies, in the run-up to the death, was not clarified further. For Heinrich Kohler, former director of the Federal Office of Justice, this is incomprehensible, as he writes in a commentary. A few toxic public prosecutors should be put on the trail, says the former highest Swiss justice official, in order to clarify whether euthanasia was also provided out of profit motive. If only 20 of the approximately 1,000 assisted suicides carried out in 2017 were subsequently irresponsible, the solution practiced today would have to be rejected for ethical but also legal reasons. The ban alone, or at least the obligation to obtain a license for the acceptance of donations and legacies from people willing to die by the various organizations, would also be welcome for ethical reasons. To use this noble word once again, "Now I am going to exit" has become a bon mot in Switzerland, which despite its coquetry can also be misunderstood. In addition, many older and also frailer human beings no longer want to be a burden on anyone. However, it is by no means old, frail, or sick human beings who want assisted suicide. Assisted suicide is independent of age. When asked, the Zurich Public Prosecutor's Office states that assisted suicide is certainly the rule for older human beings, although, according to the prosecuting authority, There are no reliable figures at all on how many younger human beings would end their lives with assisted suicide. Assisted suicide. Who decides when it is time to go? SRF Swiss Info. Two elderly women explain why they want to end their lives, even if they are not terminally ill. The Zurich Public Prosecutor's Office assumes, however, that assisted suicide organizations would use assisted suicide with juveniles only with restraint, if at all. Nevertheless, the lack of such figures seems strange in a country that cannot exactly complain about a lack of statistics. In addition, it feeds the suspicion that euthanasia organizations are granted far more goodwill by the authorities than many a restaurant business, which is immediately fined for disregarding the police hour or the smoking ban. Perhaps it is also a sign of ignorance towards an unpleasant subject like death. Perhaps it is also an indication that euthanasia as practiced in this country has long since got out of hand.
This is interesting and informative, but I was not aware of all this because I have never dealt with it in any depth until now. But if I consider everything logically, then I can only uphold my earlier judgment that the entire practice, which is carried out in the manner described, is indeed not only inhumane, contemptuous, and abhorrent, but indisputably corresponds to a state-sanctioned murder as you judge it, and as the author Michel Houellebecq also understands it in the Internet excerpt. Something like this should just as never be allowed by law in a civilized world, and also never be justified, just as a death penalty and executions to be carried out should not.
Tell me about it, my friend, because it is perfectly clear to me that such legislation and behavior is against all logic and humanity, and can only be contemplated, advocated, or even carried out by utterly depraved elements. And as I myself have observed, experienced and witnessed from early juveniles along with your father Sfath as help during my life in various states during executions, torture, stoning and manslaughter, etc., countless human beings shout pro and hurrah frenetically and vehemently as well as vindictively for such degenerate courses of action, legislation, and behavior. And all these human beings falsely and fraudulently imagine and describe themselves as accommodating earthlings, as just, humane, good-natured, and lovable. And they all pretend to be religious, halfway or strict believers in an imaginary dear God, in supposed saints and angels and such weak-and nonsense, etc., living in the self-deceptive delusion that they supposedly cannot harm a fly or a germ. If, however, they then come to harm at the hands of some other human being, or simply through some circumstance naturally arising in life, or if they fall into suffering or grief, in whatever way, then they roar unrestrainedly and unstoppably for vengeance, retribution, torture, stoning, caning, rotting, and beating, for capital punishment, mercilessness, ruin, annihilation, extermination, and destruction. As soon as the human being, who is supposedly so tremendously good, lovable, correct, righteous, believing in God and love, is personally harmed in the slightest way by other human beings, by nature or by so-called fate, etc., then all good intentions, all humanity, love, peaceableness, and justice, etc., are forgotten and evaporate like smoke and mirrors. In a flash, the human being then drops his dirty, lying, and deceitful face, larva, or mask, which he has put on to appear good, loving, just, humane, compassionate, and righteous to the outside world. And it does not take much to do that, because often a thoughtless, trivial word is enough to cause an explosion and a quarrel, or even murder and manslaughter. Because in such a moment all that breaks through to the outside world and causes mischief, which deep down in the innermost part of the character is rotten and festering in a hidden way. And this also happens when the majority of human beings, who outwardly pretend to be good, human, loving, helpful, just righteous and believing in God, neither themselves nor anyone in their own family, relatives, friendship, or acquaintance is affected by harm, suffering, or grief, etc. The truth is this: effectively, the highly praised religious faith in God, the sense of justice, the humane, good-natured, and lovable, and the humanity, etc., etc., of the majority of human beings is only valid, until it can no longer control and maintain the outward feigned hypocrisy of its alleged good human being. For then their true innermost, malicious and hateful character breaks through, roaring for revenge. Retribution, torture, stoning, caning, rotting, and beating, as well as capital punishment, mercilessness, and ruin of every conceivable possible kind, and the worse and more inhuman the better. And all the human beings, as I have observed them all over the world in their mercilessness during tortures, stonings, caning, rod punishments, and beatings, as well as during executions, witnessed their howls of revenge and their fanatical joy and satisfaction at close quarters when they themselves or others were able to torture or kill their fellow human beings. That was and is something so tremendously inhuman for which I cannot find words. And all these human beings were believers of all religions, such as Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Judaism, along with their or other various sects in their inhuman behavior in this respect.
Unfortunately, this is true, because the majority of Earth humans is in bondage to a confused belief in an alleged God. God the Father and God the Creator, who is supposed to be kind, benevolent, loving, and at the same time malicious, avenging, and mercilessly punishing if one acts contrary to his commandments, etc., which were invented by Earth humans. And the majority of Earth humans are believers and slaves to this confused and erroneous faith. Consequently, they neither perceive nor recognize the truth of natural reality, and therefore cannot grasp or understand it.
Unfortunately, and as a result of this, all believers in religion, God and sex remain beanstraw stupid in this respect, precisely because they strangle their own intellect and reason through their delusional belief and do not use these two important values, and are therefore also unable to recognize the reality of reality, and thus also the effective truth. Through this loss of reality, the human being is blind and deaf to the truth that, with regard to himself, he alone is the being exercising power over himself, who determines how, when, and what he can do, has to do, and actually does for his own weal and woe, but not an imaginary external power, such as a non-existent God. With regard to the perception, recognition, and understanding of real reality and its truth, the believers in God are completely blind and deaf, and are not even able to find the way to their own understanding and reason. This is because, in their delusion of God, they are dominated by irrepressible fear of divine punishment, which threatens them that the so boundlessly loving God will not tolerate, but will punish, if his alleged laws and recommendations are not obeyed. And this has been told in this idiotic and misleading way in all God religions to the earthlings who are addicted to faith and incapable of thinking for themselves since time immemorial, as an invention of the earliest believers in faith and God delusion, whereby, however, the believers do not think about all this nonsense. Consequently, it is also not recognized that the origin of all the laws and recommendations is based on the psychological foundations of the 77 million verse OM teaching concerning good, healthy, and righteous behavior, which was brought and taught by the early prophets Enoch, Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Emmanuel, and Mohammed, but falsified by all the chroniclers, etc., who ever lived. And this happened in all God religions and God delusions, to which, however, I would like to refer especially to those falsifications which circulate as false teachings in Christianity, such as Bible sayings which, on the one hand, are contradictory in themselves and, on the other hand, are mendaciously oriented towards the idea that an imaginary God punishes human beings if they violate the commandments of the Proverbs. I would like to compare 22 passages from an ancient, falsified scripture, which were falsified very early on, and then in the course of time, also by the reformer Martin Luther, whose criticism of the Catholic Church in 1517 caused a reformation and thus a division of the Church into a Protestant and a Catholic Church. He, Luther, also falsified the Bible sayings. As these, however, had already been falsified before him and which he did not know in the original, as these are contained in the OM doctrine of the original Universal Covenanter Nocodemion. And these 22 sayings I would now also like to quote as Luther falsified them, though I will also append to each verse that which is given by the OM collection.
I guess that would be of significance and importance, which is why I think you should put your word into action.
But that takes some time.
Da.
Because on the one hand, I have to search out these Bible verses first, because I cannot recite them by heart, but it is important to recite them literally. And on the other hand, I have to rummage through the OM teachings to find the corresponding original verses, which I then also have to transform into the German language. Furthermore, it is to be said that these OM verses are directed towards individual human beings, and thus not in general, precisely in the way that they actually correspond to behavioral guidelines.
I know that, and I am aware that it must be that you elaborate everything and then insert your work where we are talking about it now.
Your suggestion in my ear, dear friend. However, the whole thing will be somewhat time-consuming and will take some time. This also because the OM memory bank still contains many terms that are no longer in common use today. Consequently, I will have to translate them out.
You also had to do that when you retrieved the OM and reworded it into German, which was not an easy job for you because the old SPR.
Yes, it's good. Of course, it was a bit difficult, but the important thing is that I was able to do the work. So I'm going to pretend and put everything in at this point in our conversation as you want it. But look here, this is the God tome where I can pick out all the verses. A, numbered 1, 22. B, bold black. Insertion from Luther Bible, OM teaching, =urtext my son. Reject not the chastening of the Lord, neither be unwilling when he reproveth thee. For whom the Lord loveth he reproveth, and is well pleased with him as a father with his son. Proverbs 3, 11, 12. By discerning and understanding, learn to be moderate in all things and to conform to the truth of life. Therefore, do not reject the truth and never be unwilling, but continually rebuke yourself willingly and lead yourself to watchfulness, for only in this way will you attain to your own good pleasure. A prudent man seeth the evil coming and hideth himself, but the prudent runneth on and is punished. Proverbs 27, 12. Be thou ever prudent and watchful. Act as it were, and look for things to come, that they be not hid from thee. Be thou not unwise, and thou shalt not be guilty, neither shalt thou make atonement. All who have sinned without the law will also perish without the law, and all who have sinned under the law will also be condemned by the law. Romans 2:12. Obey the laws which set before you the truth of life and the true conduct of life, and you will be strong in life, never lost in it, always cherishing it, never condemning it. Those I love I rebuke and discipline. Be diligent, therefore, and repent. Revelation 3:19. If you love yourself in a just and righteous way, you always rebuke yourself. You are always diligent not to make yourself guilty of any repentance. Now every chastening, when it is, seemeth to us not joy, but pain. But afterward it bringeth forth peace and righteousness as fruit unto them that are exercised thereby. Hebrews 12:11. Keep discipline and order over yourself, even when it causes not joy, but sorrow and pain. For fruit will always come from it, bringing about in you peace and freedom, righteousness, and even measure. Fear is not in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear reckons with punishment, but he that feareth is not perfect in love. 1 John 4:18. If you allow fear or dread to arise in you, you are treading a path that leads you astray, far from the given, and thereby to where there is neither love nor truth. But he who knows him not, and has done what deserves blows, will suffer few blows. To whom much is given, from him much will be sought, and to whom much is entrusted, from him all the more will be required. Luke 12:48. Always hold back before you do anything that might be unjust, for in doing so you too will suffer unjustness. If you are just and wise, then your advice will be sought. Then be careful when you entrust something to others, for then even more familiar things will be demanded of you. If any man sin, and do contrary to any commandment of the Lord, which he ought not to do, and have not known it, and sin, and bring iniquity upon himself. Deuteronomy 5:17. Never shalt thou do contrary to any law or commandment, whether thou know it or not, and thou shalt incur guilt or punishment. Repent and turn away from all transgression, lest you fall into iniquity. Ezekiel 18:30. Keep away from transgression, and never act knowingly by wrongdoing, lest you fall into guilt. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned. Mark 16:16. If thou indulge not in faith, and live not in untruth, thou shalt attain unto true knowledge. But if thou believe, thou shalt damn thyself. Above all things, brothers and sisters, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath. Let a yes be yes to you, and a no be no to you, lest you fall into judgment. James 5:12. Thou shalt not swear, nor take an oath, by heaven, or by the earth, or by any delusion, condition, or notion, for thou hast never any power over it. Always let thy word alone be true in honor and uprightness, and so let thy word of honor be yea for yea, and nay for nay. Blessed is the human being whom God rebukes, therefore do not resist the chastening of the Almighty. Job 5:17. Honest and righteous are you when you rebuke yourself, therefore do not resist your own true righteousness. There is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, because the law of the Spirit makes alive in Christ Jesus, for he has set you free from the law of sin and death. Romans 8:1-2. No guilt, no punishment, and no condemnation can befall you if you obey and keep the given righteous laws and recommendations of all creation. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for he is thy Lord, and he will not suffer thee to go unpunished, if thou take his name in vain. Deuteronomy 5:11. Thou shalt not do violence to any of the works of creation. Neither shalt thou abuse them, nor shalt thou disregard them. For it shall be a hurt and a destruction unto thee, and to the world, and to all existence. Preach the word and stand by it, whether in season or out of season. Reprove everyone, threatening and exhorting with all patience and doctrine, but punishing if disobeyed. 2 Timothy 4:2. When you speak justly, whether in season or out of season, always speak the truth. Stand by your true word even when it is patient, abrupt, teaching, instructing, rebuking, exhorting, soft, loud, or very loud, whether it wants to be heard or not. A God who brings the lonely home, who brings out the captives, that it may be well with them, but the apostate abides in dry land. Psalm 68:7. You will never be lonely, and you will never be a prisoner of yourself if you form your own personality, open yourself up to it, and rule and command yourself. You will know in your heart that the Lord your God has brought you up as a man brings up his son. 8:5. Know and perceive in thine understanding that thou must stop thyself, as the caretakers stop their shoots. But the gift of grace is not like sin. For if by one sin many died, much more the grace and gift of God abounded to many through the grace of the one human being, Jesus Christ. Romans 5:15. Know that only your own righteousness keeps you from transgression, from destruction, from visitation, and gives you lasting goodness. He that walketh with the wise shall be wise, but he that is the companion of fools shall have evil. Proverbs 13:20. When wise men surround you and you learn wisdom from them, then folly, misery, sorrow, and distress will not be added to your order, nor will grief, sorrow, and anguish. The Lord knows how to save the pious from temptation, but to keep the unrighteous for the day of judgment, to punish them. 2 Peter 2:9. Know that thy virtuousness alone keepeth thee from temptation and unrighteousness, and thine honesty alone keepeth thee from rebuke and banishment and separation by tribunal. I say unto you, no, but if ye repent not, ye shall all likewise perish. Luke 13:3. Know that iniquity shall not trouble thee, lest repentance come to thee, but live and work on. The Lord preserveth the stranger and keepeth the fatherless and the widow, but the wicked he leadeth astray. Psalm 146:9. Protect and keep your own kind, the offspring and the stranger, the widowed, the needy, the sick and the aged, but do not let them lead you astray by shepherding meaning of terms, words. Creation constitution =, creation personality =, character, intellect seeing =, mind carers =, parents sprouts =, offspring stop =, educate, visitation =, punishment honesty =, morality moral conduct, valor =, righteousness, expulsion =, condemnation, ban =, exclusion, segregation =, isolation, tribunal =, court, offspring =, children, procrastination =, fraud, deceit, overreaching.
You will execute it correctly, I know you will.
I must, of course. But what I'm looking at right now is actually also part of the 22 verses that I want to interpret, because this saying here has also been distorted in its interpretation many times since time immemorial. So I will also retrieve this one from the memory bank and correct it. I can do all things through him who makes me mighty. Philippians 4:13. Know that it is only through you that all things are able to make you mighty. But what I have to add to all that I have already said relates to stupidity. We have already spoken about this in detail. But there are still more facts to be mentioned because various things need to be dealt with in more detail so that the whole thing is really understood correctly. First of all, it is to be said that the language has to be changed by the clever, who have always been of the erroneous opinion that they have to change and modernize the German language, etc. But in the process, more and more idiotic inconsistencies arise. Terms are completely misinterpreted and misspelled. What the player and linguists have to say about this, who have been defining languages for many millennia, so also the language German, which originated from the original language German, contradicts everything that the earthly German language scientists or German linguists are dumbing down with their new German orthography mania. This has also continued to this day, although the linguists are not really proficient in the German language and dumb down the verbal language and the written language. Or, as the Playaran linguists put it, devalue, deface, falsify, misinterpret, and misinterpretation. Classical spelling, 1901, 1998, has been modernized or idiotized as of the 1st of August 2006, as has been done time and again by megalomaniac linguists, as linguists in the German language have completely misinterpreted or distorted by adding extra letters to existing terms from old original words. This is the case, for example, with the term Palestinian, to which another letter has been added, making it Palestinian, which makes absolutely no sense, as is also the case with the term Guatemalan, which should correctly be Guatemalan, as this emerges from the original term in the Guatemalan language. The falsifications that occur in the German language, but also in other languages, with regard to the misinterpretation of certain terms, especially with regard to psychology and the description of their actual meanings, go far beyond any banality because they correspond much more to a catastrophic, irresponsible misleading. If the ancient Hellenic or ancient Greek terms are used and defined, from which linguists invented and misinterpreted new terms for certain things, objects and things, etc., which then found their way into German and other languages, then the original terms correspond to completely different values. The same applies to linguistic inventions of false terms, which linguists have made up from Old Latin or the Latin language stage that preceded Classical Latin, and which also contain completely different values than the values of the original terms. As is the case with the falsifications of terms and word values that have been invented and misinterpreted by linguists from original terms of ancient languages, the same procedure can be found in psychology. In psychology, however, certain terms and word values are defined and explained in a completely wrong way, in that absolute nonsense is brought to bear because the so bright, clever psychology experts, in truth, do not know what and how the terms were and are to be fundamentally constructed and assessed. Therefore, even today, after hundreds and thousands of years, the individual concepts and values are interpreted by the most diverse false representations of illusionary attempts at explanation into something which, however, has no connection whatsoever with effective reality and its truth. As an example of this fact, I will only use the terms stupidity and stupidity, which are defined by psychology in a completely erroneous and confused way, as something that has nothing whatsoever to do with actual reality and truth. The following are examples of this.
When looking further into stupidity, what it is supposed to be, descriptions can be found in various psychology reference books, such as
In a narrower sense, as is claimed by certain psychologists, stupidity is to be described as a deficient ability, as a result of which no appropriate conclusions can be drawn or learned from perceptions. This is a deficiency that is partly based on ignorance of facts that are necessary to form a judgment, but is also based on insufficient intelligence or training of the mind. Billy's note: there is apparently no knowledge that intelligence and mind are completely wrong terms. There is also a disadvantage with regard to a certain inertia and sluggishness in the ability to comprehend or slowness in combining the available facts. In this sense, Kant calls the lack of power of judgment what is called stupidity, and postulates that such an infirmity cannot be remedied at all. It is also misleading that the causes lie in the emotional sphere, namely the emotional resistance to dependence on opinion leaders and insights, but also in relation to indoctrination and manipulation by others. Furthermore, it is also claimed that cognitive programs, such as ideologies, philosophies, religions, and worldviews, would act as maladaptive programs, or poorly adapted programs as stupidity. This would hinder the wise coping with real demands. At least this is what a James Wells 1988 claims in his Anthropological Cultural Historical Analysis, which also includes acts of political stupidity crusades, Bay of Pigs invasion. Robert Musil, 1937, names the paradox that every human being who talks about stupidity assumes that he is above things, or that he is clever, although this is precisely a presumption and a sign of stupidity. Another and somewhat different paradox is to be found in a concept of a second kind of stupidity, proposed by the social psychologist Peter R. Hofstadter in the style of the second kind of error in statistics. Around 1900, stupidity was considered to be a state of affairs that lay within the normal range of cognitive abilities, which is why it could be distinguished from mental disability or nonsense. A Werner van Treek, on the other hand, suggests that stupidity is relative. Therefore, there is a situation-dependent stupidity, and thus individual, social, and historically different assessments of stupidity. What is stupid for one human being seen from his own perspective is not necessarily stupidity for another or several others. The result of this wrong view is that something that was once considered wise and correct can now appear to be stupid. In the essay On the Genesis of Stupidity, Horkheimer Adorno state, "Stupidity is a stigma."
What I have to say in addition to these statements is the following. Very often in literature as well as in real life, fools, such as the medieval court jesters, are portrayed as wise, admonishing, clever, and shrewd, whereas philosophers are effectively unworldly fools. If the entire mass of Earth humans is examined, it can be seen that they are pathologically delusional, both in mass and individually, and also with regard to those human beings who really cultivate stupidity as a result of their belief in God and salvation. These human beings are not even aware that, on the one hand, they live in fear of being punished by the imaginary God who exists only in their delusion, if they were to doubt or effectively question his imagined existence. On the other hand, it is impossible for them, due to their delusion of faith, to allow even an iota of an attempt to use reason and rationality to arise. If the reason for stupidity is sought, then it is found solely in the fact that, with regard to a precisely determined thing, understanding and reason are not used in order to fathom it, to clarify it, to recognize it, and to understand whose child of understanding and reason it is. Explained differently, stupidity means nothing other than that in relation to something specific, a thing, a thought, a certain line of thought, something not provable, facts, etc., a lack of certainty, faith, a concept or word, a fixed conviction, statement, idea, opinion, piety or belief, etc., is not thought about, considered, researched, fathomed, and not recognized in a real reality truthful way through understanding and reason, and consequently also not understood as certainty. And if this is not the case, then there is also no breakthrough to reality and truth. But as it has been said since time immemorial, ex nihilo nihil fit, or from nothing comes nothing. If one gets to the bottom of the term stupidity, then it does not find its origin in the Latin words and terms imbecilitas idiocy, imbecilitatis weakness, stultitia, stultitiae, stultus foolishness, silliness, simplicity, or angustia narrowness, etc., as according to the Plejaren linguists, only linguists with insufficient knowledge of the Latin language, etc., claimed and still claim today. These, the Plejaren linguists, explain that the term stupidity originates from the ancient language German, from which all Nordic languages developed at the earliest time, to which the predecessor languages of German also belong. And according to the Plejaren explanations, the original term dement from the language German, of which today's mankind has not even the slightest knowledge, formed and designated the value that stood for when neither intellect nor reason was used to get to the bottom of a matter, to clarify it and to recognize the real reality and its effective truth. From this German term, some word changes took place in the course of time, up to today's term stupidity, which, however, still has the same meaning as at its time of origin, since it stood for the fact that with regard to a definition of a thing, it is necessary to use reason and intellect in order to find its reality and truth. But if this is not done, then it corresponds to a fallacy or stupidity, because real reality and truth are impossible without thinking, reasoning and exploring, as well as recognizing and understanding controlled by understanding and reason. And something can only be assumed, but not proven, but through the mere unprovable assumption it becomes a confused and erroneous belief. But this was also known to the ancient Latins, who made this fact absolutely clear to the earthlings with the following words: in ratio veritas, or in understanding and reason, lies truth. Now, stupidity corresponds to the fact that it refers in each case to something quite specific, but not to everything in general. Stupidity, once again, refers exactly to what corresponds to a certain thing, etc., which is not processed, not considered, not pondered over, and not clarified by understanding and reason. This makes it clear that stupidity is related to a single thing, or to its several different things or things, etc., that are simply not processed by understanding and reason, and therefore neither fathomed nor understood. This prevents the effective facts from being brought out into consciousness, taken up by it, grasped, comprehended, and made conscious to it, whereby the whole of the thing to be considered, the thing, etc., can be seen comprehensively and clearly, not seen through or seen through, processed, thoroughly developed, and thus not classified and comprehended in its effective real reality and truth. If stupidity is present, then this does not at all mean stupidity, not a weakness of consciousness, nor a lack of intelligentum or intelligencein, but solely a lack of the use of ratio or of understanding and reason. Because, as has already been explained several times, stupidity consists solely in the fact that understanding and reason are not used in order to get to the bottom of something, etc., specifically to something quite specific or to a thing, whereby understanding and reason are not used precisely for this purpose. Consequently, they are not clarified in sufficient depth until reality is recognized and truth is grasped. This therefore corresponds to stupidity, whereby this term means that there is such a lack of aptitude that for some reason, in the case of faith, a lack of aptitude to use understanding and reason caused by the delusion of imagination, stupidity manifests itself in the intellectual field through the non-use of understanding and reason. This means that there is a self-inflicted ignorance, weakness of understanding and reason, and thus an insufficient intelligence or lack of intelligence, which in any case always refers to a precisely determined matter that is not clarified by understanding and reason in a logical way up to the recognition of reality and the grasp of truth. Stupidity has in no way anything to do with a general weakness of intelligence or with a general lack of intelligence, But stupidity is and remains in every case only related to a certain thing, a certain fact, or to a given circumstance, a given fact, a reality, a state of affairs, and precisely to a very certain thing, for which neither understanding nor reason are used to create the necessary clarity, in that an incontrovertible recognition of reality and apprehension of truth emerges from it. But as far as stupidity is concerned, this does not mean, as is assumed and claimed by the so-called experts, that it is a factor of a general lack of aptitude. Basically, it does not correspond to reality and truth that stupidity is based on a general lack of understanding and reason, and therefore also not on a general lack of talent in the intellectual field. Ignorance, weak, insufficient intelligentum. Also, the nonsense assertion of earthly psychology stupidity corresponds to a lack of intelligence. Pars pro toto, also a resulting foolish action, is absolutely nonsensical compared to reality and truth, and proves that since time immemorial the whole psychology elite has no or only very little idea of the psyche factor, be it the psyche of human beings or that of an animal. How else could it be that the psychology elite misleads such nonsense as stupidity denotes a lack of intelligence, pars pro toto also a resulting foolish action? And the fact that the false term intelligence is used instead of intelligentum, or being intelligent, because the term intelligence corresponds to a false meaning and denotes nothing more than the memory of the intellect, is proof enough of how ignorant the earthly psychology elite is, but still thinks that they have eaten the knowledge and their wisdom with shovel diggers. That the earthly psychology elite does not understand at all what stupidity is in the first place, what it is based on and how it arises, is clear and obvious from many clever psychology reference books, but also from stupid proverbs, as is explained in Wanders Deutsches Sprichwörter Lexikon of 1866, where it is written. Another dimension of stupidity is emphasized. In the very extensive collection of proverbs on the subject, it becomes clear that there are also the stupid who cheat their way through and thus get far. Half the world belongs to the stupid. The stupid one is lucky. The stupidest farmers harvest the biggest potatoes. When I look around at claims about stupidity, there are often attempts to explain it colloquially through specialist literature, whereby incredibly wrong word choices, formulations, and attempts to explain it all completely tear it apart and make it inexplicable. If, for example, stupidity is presented as a lack of ability, then this is supposed to adequately grasp a given situation and react effectively and efficiently in it, whereby a cognitive function or ability to absorb and process information is meant. In colloquial language, we often also speak of stupidity when it is fundamentally simply a matter of ignorance or non-knowledge, or a lack of availability of knowledge, or prior experience, or with regard to any other stored memory content. When stupidity is mentioned in this context, no distinction is also made as to whether the lack of memory content and knowledge is due to dementia, or whether the background of the lack of knowledge is due to naivety or inexperience. Well, stupidity corresponds to a personal stupefaction, because this can be acquired by the human being through an acceptance of an unprovable thing, ideology or opinion, etc., especially through a belief, whether religious or through other faith, and then can only free himself from it through great effort, or not at all. Stupidity can therefore be personally learned in this way, just as the human being can also be educated to stupidity through education. Believers, as a result of stupidity, because due to their faith they can use neither intellect nor reason and are not responsive to them, take any and all faith nonsense at face value, and thereby suppress in every respect the very own ability of their self-determination, self-decision, and self-action. Through their delusional faith, which forbids them any thinking about reality and any search for truth, they are prevented from deviating even one iota from their faith, in order to muster even a semblance of a neutral thought effort to find the truth of effective reality. Therefore, all believers in religion, sects, and God, in their delusion of faith, remain closed to the possibility of using understanding and reason, as a result of which they have fallen into complete stupidity in relation to the recognition of reality and truth, and a way of life oriented accordingly. A belief, in fact in every respect, therefore means in every case unlimited stupidity, and if a human being is afflicted by it, then he is dominated by this stupidity, and this quite irrespective of whether he has only completed a simple school education or a university course, whether he has learned a profession or not, or has a doctorate or professorial title or a special profession, brandishes some title, fancies himself to be a special greatness, or is effectively a professional luminary, and possesses extraordinary abilities in a certain field. The fact is that if a human being is a slave to a religious sectarian belief, he is no longer able to turn to the actual reality and its truth. Consequently, he is unable to make use of the possibility of addressing his intellect and his reason, whereby the perception and recognition of the actuality of the real factuality of the correctness and irrefutable and unalterable authenticity of all authentic existence of the entire effective real reality and truth remains closed to him. This can best be recognized and understood when nature in all its biodiversity, and also the planet Earth itself, is perceived, observed, recognized and understood in all its existence and in all its secrets. As I have learned from your father Sfath, and therefore know things that earthly natural scientists, geologists, and other earth scientists cannot even dream of. Effectively, everything around is much more immense and immeasurable than all the scientific luminaries of all scientific disciplines can even imagine. When I think of what Sfath has taught me and what he has made me see and hear, what the earth, nature, the atmosphere, the soil, the oceans, springs, rivers and lakes, the trees, forests, moors, steppes, tundras and primeval forests as well as the floodplains, mountains and the entire biodiversity and everything else that exists and lives in general contains and communicates peacefully with each other, then the entire earthly sciences can probably never grasp this. This, like for example everything that Sfath has allowed me to see through his apparatus, devices and screens and to hear through sound sensors, which surpasses anything I could otherwise perceive with my eyes and ears. I was able to see only plants and various living beings of many genera and species in their entire inner structure, or in their comprehensive living pulsating organism, without the plants or other living beings being damaged or injured. And effectively I could also hear their life impulses and life vibrations. I could also hear the peculiar life sounds of the atmosphere itself, as well as those of oxygen and many other atmospheric substances, recognize their colors and also smell their peculiar scents, which has remained hidden from earthly scientists until today, and will remain hidden for a long time to come. This also applies to the millions of fine and subtle sounds and swinging waves that testify to the vitality and essence of the atmosphere, oxygen, and all gases as well as the climate itself. Likewise, the countless different sounds and swinging waves in the Earth's soil from all the countless different living beings also gave me impressions that I cannot describe in words alone. Every single genus or species of all life forms in the Earth, on the Earth and in the skies of the Earth vibrates out its own life sounds, movement sounds and food processing sounds, etc., which are so different that every genus or species can be exactly defined and determined according to the sounds of life. Movements, food intake, and even copulation, etc., and this without being able to observe them directly. The apparatuses and devices with the very fine and most delicate probes have allowed me to perceive and recognize so much acoustically in this respect, and have imparted to me a diversity of the bulk of the whole, living of all existence, that I could never express it even halfway verbally or with written words. I can only encompass everything in such a way by saying that the immense and for human beings inconceivable immensity of creation and all its creations are so incalculable, immense and unrestricted and boundless, that the whole in its actual extent can never be grasped and never comprehended by a human being, and can neither be interpreted nor reasonably explained.
You know, as always, very well how to explain the necessary facts in sufficient detail. Consequently, also no objection could be raised that your explanations could not be understood or misunderstood.
Explanations should always be detailed and in such a way that they can really be understood. Unfortunately, however, you are not allowed to say everything openly, and you are not allowed to talk about many things, such as certain things of a certain earthly technical and digital development, as well as the silvers in the sea and in certain seas, etc. .
Unquestionably, there is no arguing about all that. Now, however, Edouard, dear friend, I want to discuss with you some of what has been said.
Of course.